A few years ago, during my time at cosmetology school, our class took a field trip to a big beauty show in a larger city about 2 hours away from campus. The event promised to showcase the latest hair and nail techniques, with experts sharing their skills. It was a fantastic opportunity for us to learn and network. To save money, we split into small groups to share hotel rooms. I ended up bunking with 3 other girls in one room. After checking into the hotel and unpacking, the atmosphere was full of excitement. It felt like a fun sleepover before the big show the next day. To celebrate, we decided to head out for some drinks and snacks. Wandering around the city, chatting and laughing, we eventually found a cozy spot to eat and relax. When we returned to the hotel about an hour later, it was late, and a few of the girls were tipsy. I wasn't drinking since I was just shy of turning 21 and couldn't order from the bar yet. Back in the room, we were unwinding, talking about our plans for the next day, when the hotel phone suddenly rang around 11 p.m. The sound startled us. It's not often you get a call on a hotel room phone, especially that late at night. We exchanged confused looks before I decided to pick up. "Hello?" I answered hesitantly. A man's voice on the other end claimed that our room hadn't been paid for and insisted that one of us needed to come down to the lobby immediately to settle the bill. His tone was firm but not overly aggressive at first. This didn't make sense. We had all pooled our money and given it to Molly, who paid at check-in. I even remembered watching her complete the transaction and collect our room keys. There was no way we hadn't paid. I calmly told him, "We've already paid for our room. If there's any issue, we can sort it out in the morning." But the man didn't back down. He insisted that if someone didn't come to the lobby right away, we wouldn't be allowed to stay the night. His tone grew more urgent, and the whole situation started to feel off. My gut told me something wasn't right. It seemed incredibly unprofessional for the hotel to call us this late, especially if the issue could wait until the morning. I told the man firmly, "If there's really a problem, send someone to our room. Otherwise, we'll handle this tomorrow." He didn't like that. His voice rose, and he began insisting even more forcefully that someone had to come down. He said there would be consequences if we didn't comply, though he didn't specify what those consequences might be. At this point, alarm bells were ringing in my head. If this was truly the hotel staff, why weren't they sending someone up? Why all the urgency in the middle of the night? I hung up the phone and turned to my classmates, explaining what had happened. They were just as confused as I was. We all agreed that the situation felt strange. If the payment really were an issue, it didn't make sense for the front desk to handle it this way. Nobody came to our room that night, and we weren't kicked out. Still, we didn't sleep well, keeping the chain lock firmly in place on the door and glancing at it every time we heard a noise in the hallway. The next morning, we went to the front desk to check out. While there, we asked about the call. To our shock, the person working at the desk had no idea what we were talking about. They confirmed that our room was fully paid for and said the front desk wouldn't have called us that late. We all exchanged uneasy glances. Who made that call? And why were they so determined to get one of us to the lobby alone in the middle of the night? Feeling unsettled, we hurried out of the hotel, eager to leave the entire experience behind us. At the time, I brushed it off. Nothing bad had happened, and we weren't kicked out. But now, looking back, I can't help but feel a deep sense of unease. Who was on the other end of that phone, and what were their intentions? Even now, years later, the memory still gives me chills. It was the summer of 1999, and I was spending my vacation with my mom in a small town in New Mexico. The days were scorching, and the evenings were quiet, filled only with the sounds of crickets. I was a 12-year-old girl with a lot of attitude, always thinking I was much older than I really was. That summer, I easily made friends with a few girls who lived just down the street from my mom's house. We spent every moment together, a group of 4 girls who thought we were older and smarter than everyone else. There was Nikki, Katie, Julie, and me. We were part of the last generation to use home phones, play outside on the trampoline until it got dark, and have sleepovers. We watched movies on VHS tapes and listened to music on our Walkmans. At the time, it was normal for kids to walk around town at night, and we rarely locked the front door. We didn't have cell phones or the internet. My backyard was surrounded by a concrete wall with a gate, and beyond that was a vast, open desert that seemed endless. The ground was dry, covered with dirt, cacti, and small shrubs scattered throughout. In the distance, you could see mountains faint and far away. Our small town had a busy railroad track running right through the middle, and the main street was full of gas stations, diners, motels, and a few tourist spots. It was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, and life felt simple. But our parents all gave us the same warnings: stay out of the desert, stay away from the train tracks, and don't walk down the main street at night. Did we listen? Not at all. Julie, Nikki, and I spent our days exploring the desert with its wide-open spaces and scattered cacti. We'd cross the train tracks where we sometimes saw trains passing by, and then walk down the main street past all the gas stations and shops to get to Katie's house. It felt like a big adventure, and we didn't worry about the dangers we were supposed to avoid. Sometimes, we'd walk around until it got dark, and other days we'd go to my house to jump on the trampoline. On this particular day, we went to Katie's house, ready to stay for the weekend since her parents were out of town. We planned to have a party on the first night. The girls were jumping from a spiral staircase onto a giant beanbag, even though I didn't join in because I was really afraid of heights. Next, we got ready for our sleepover and decided to watch the original Exorcist movie with Linda Blair. It was terrifying, and I couldn't sleep that night. The second night, we told our parents that Katie's mom would drive us to the movies, but we didn't mention that Katie's parents were actually out of town, so we were on our own. We all got money for the movies and then walked down the main street to buy junk food at the little store, which is what we called it. I wish I could say we were paying attention to our surroundings, but we weren't. We didn't notice that a man had followed us all the way back to Katie's house. Katie's parents were very wealthy. They had a big property with many buildings and old cars that her dad was fixing up. Their house had a large open space with the kitchen, dining area, and living room all in one big room with no walls, lined with windows. There were 2 doors, one in the front and one in the back. The day went as planned. We got our junk food and made it home safely. We made pizza in the oven, and for some reason, one of the girls turned on the TV to watch the news while we were eating. We heard a report about a suspicious man walking down the main street. That was all it said, just a suspicious man. A few hours later, something happened that I don't quite remember, but someone said something that upset Julie, and she stormed out of the house. I went after her and opened the front door. I sat with her on a bench while she complained about the other 2 girls. Then, suddenly, the air felt tense, and Julie felt it too. I quietly asked if she thought someone was watching us. She gave a small nod, and then we were blinded by bright lights. Someone was in a car in the driveway, shining their headlights directly at us. My heart pounded as I stood up and pulled Julie out of the spot where she seemed frozen. As we turned to run inside, the man made a strange sound, a high-pitched squeal that suddenly changed into a growl. I was terrified, but I pushed through my fear and hurried us both inside the house. As soon as we got inside, the headlights went off, and it was completely dark again. I locked the door and turned off the lights. By then, Julie had calmed down enough to tell the other two girls what had happened while I checked the back door and turned off every light. I told them to be quiet, and we listened by the back door. I heard the car door close, and I was praying to every god that he would leave. Then, right next to my cheek, the door handle started to turn slowly, then quickly. I crawled away from the door and joined my friends. For the next 2 or 3 hours, we stayed completely still, listening to the man banging on every window and door, trying to get inside. The phone was across the room next to 2 windows. Finally, I gathered the courage to run to the phone and call my mom. I told her that we were alone and someone was trying to get inside. After hanging up, we waited. Julie yelled at the man that we had called the police, and suddenly, the banging stopped. We listened as he got into his car, and then we heard that strange sound again, a squeal that turned into a growl. After that, he was gone. My mom and stepdad arrived and checked the whole place. The really scary part was the scratch marks all over the doors and windows. Katie ended up spending the rest of the weekend at Nikki's house and had a wild story to tell her parents when they got home. Our parents didn't punish us for lying and being reckless. I guess 2 hours of terror from a madman was punishment enough. About 10 years ago, when I was 15, my Aunt Jo, my best friend Lynn, and I decided to have an impromptu sleepover. We were at my Nan's house, a cozy little place in a quiet part of town. The living room was cluttered with blankets and pillows, and we had spread ourselves out on the floor, eating pizza and chips while watching movies. We spent the evening laughing, gossiping, and making memories, completely unaware of the terrifying events that would unfold later. It was a Friday, and by 11 p.m., we were having so much fun that none of us wanted to leave. So, we made the decision to stay the night instead of going home. It wasn't the first time we'd had a sleepover at Nan's, but it was different this time. We didn't bother setting up sleeping bags or creating separate beds. Instead, we all crammed into Joe's double bed, deciding to sleep top and tail, some of us at the head, others at the foot. It seemed like a great idea at the time, and we continued to chat and goof around as we settled in for the night. Joe, Lynn, and I were always the kind of girls who stayed up late, usually talking about boys, life, and everything in between. We'd throw popcorn at each other, tell silly jokes, and even make prank calls to friends. On this particular night, we joked that we should try to sleep but knew deep down we'd end up just laughing until we all fell asleep out of sheer exhaustion. We kept tugging the blanket back and forth, laughing at each other's jokes, and trying to calm down enough to sleep. It was around 1 a.m. when we finally decided that it was probably time to try to sleep. We turned off the lights, but our laughter didn't stop right away. We stayed up talking for a little while longer in the dark, and I think at that point, we were just so tired that our voices started to quiet down. I had my head at the end of the bed near the wall, while Joe and Lynn were facing the window. The room was on the first floor, which, as I learned later, is called the second floor in the US. The bed was positioned in such a way that the window was directly in front of it. At first, I wasn't bothered by the sounds outside. It was a typical suburban neighborhood, and sometimes the wind would brush against the window, making it creak or rattle. However, after a few minutes, I started to hear something strange, scraping noises coming from outside. At first, I thought it was just the wind or maybe a tree branch brushing against the wall, but the sound continued. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like something, or someone, was moving outside. I tried to ignore it, hoping I would soon drift off to sleep, but the noise kept interrupting my thoughts. I lay there, wide awake, trying to rationalize the sound. It wasn't the wind. It was more deliberate, like scraping metal against stone. Just as I was starting to drift off, Joe screamed, a piercing cry that sent chills down my spine. She jumped out of bed so fast, her panic palpable. "Get away from the window," she shouted, her voice high with fear. Lynn screamed right after her. My heart dropped to my stomach as I quickly turned to see what was going on. I had no idea what had startled them, but I immediately saw what they were reacting to. Standing outside the window was the shadow of a person, arms raised as if trying to get into the room. It wasn't a reflection or a trick of the light, it was a clear figure, blocking the dim glow from the streetlight outside. For a moment, everything went still. We all froze, unable to move. I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow, my mind trying to process what I was seeing. Panic took over, and we ran downstairs, screaming for my Nan. She rushed out of the living room, immediately concerned, asking what had happened. Joe was crying, Lynn and I were in shock, and we tried to explain in breathless, jumbled sentences what had just occurred. My Nan, never one to panic, quickly called the police. She grabbed a bat from the closet, her face stern but resolute, and headed upstairs to check if the person was still there. The police arrived within what felt like minutes. They took our statements, looking thoroughly around the house, but they couldn't find anyone. They combed through the area, checking the yard and the roof, but there was no sign of anyone hiding. After a while, they gave us a number to call in case anything strange happened again or if the person returned. We decided to sleep downstairs instead of going back to Joe's room. I don't think any of us had any intention of going back to sleep that night. We were all too rattled. Joe, in particular, was visibly shaken. It took a while for her to calm down, even after the police had left. The whole situation felt unreal. After a few minutes of sitting in silence, Joe explained what had happened. The person had gone onto the roof, apparently trying to get in through Joe's window. It wasn't until then that I understood why her window was so important. Joe's window could be opened from both the top and the bottom, and she usually opened it from the top for some fresh air. The person outside had clearly been trying to open it from the bottom, likely hoping to break in without anyone noticing. That's when the real horror of the situation hit us. We had been lucky. We were all so oblivious to the danger that had been so close. If Joe had been alone that night, she would have been lying in bed with her back to the window and wouldn't have seen the shadow. The fact that the three of us were there meant the difference between life and death, or at least a terrifying break-in that could have escalated much worse. The rest of the night was a blur. We stayed downstairs, still in shock, unsure of what had just happened. We kept the lights on and didn't sleep at all. Eventually, when the morning light started creeping through the windows, we finally calmed down enough to realize how close we had come to something much worse. The police never found the person, and to this day, I don't know who was outside that window or what their intentions were. But I know one thing for sure, we were lucky. Had we not been awake, had we not been in that room together, the outcome might have been much different. We never talked about that night much afterward. It was something that felt too strange, too surreal to share. But every time I think back on it, I realize how close we came to a truly horrifying situation, and how our quick thinking, Joe's scream, our dash downstairs, probably saved us. My friend had moved to a new apartment about a week ago after finishing college, so I planned to stay overnight. We were going to a mutual friend's birthday, and it would be too late for me to go home afterward. Her place wasn't fully set up yet since she was still moving in, but when we arrived, I told her I felt a strange energy in the apartment. I didn't think too much about it at first, though. We spent the evening together, had some laughs, and enjoyed a nice time before heading to bed. Around 2 a.m., we both settled into the same queen-sized bed, but I woke up at 2:30 a.m. to her screaming right in my face. She apologized, saying she got scared because she wasn't used to sleeping next to someone after living in dorms for so long. Sleepily, I calmed her down, and she apologized again. We both turned over and tried to go back to sleep. I often have very vivid dreams, mostly nightmares because of my medication, but that night I had a dream about a creepy clown slowly poking its head through her closet door. The room in my dream looked exactly the same as it did in real life, which made it feel even more real and unsettling. The strange part was that my friend woke up again in the middle of the night and started mumbling about her own dream. She said she saw a clown, or some evil figure, calling her to the closet. She told me she felt scared and didn't want to go near it. I was too sleepy at the time to think much of it, so I went back to sleep. Later, when there was a bit of light in the room, probably around 5 a.m., I woke up and saw a short person in a blue t-shirt hurrying out of her bathroom. I was still groggy and confused, unsure of who they were or how they got in, but I was too tired to react. I just thought it was one of her roommates and went back to sleep. We both woke up around 8:30 or 9 o'clock and I teased her a little about talking in her sleep. But then, without me saying anything, she told me she had had a dream about a clown and described exactly what I had seen in my own dream. At this point, I was really creeped out, but I thought maybe hearing her talk about the dream in the middle of the night had made me have a similar dream. Then she went into the bathroom to brush her teeth and noticed that both doors, one leading to the hallway and the other to her bedroom, were open. She panicked because she remembered closing them before. I casually said, "Oh, it was probably your roommate who got up to use the bathroom," but then she told me that none of her roommates were there because they were signing the lease in September. By now, we were both really scared. She went to check the patio door and found it unlocked and open, even though she always locks it carefully every day. Just so you know, she doesn't have any security cameras, and nothing valuable was stolen. We thought maybe a homeless person had broken in, but all the food was still in the kitchen. We couldn't explain what had happened. The strange combination of shared dreams, the mysterious figure in the bathroom, and the open doors made us feel like we were caught in some kind of eerie, unexplainable situation. The more we talked about it, the more unnerved we became. It was as if something, or someone, had been watching us during the night. The unsettling atmosphere in the apartment seemed to have changed overnight, and no matter how much we tried to rationalize it, we couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. We stayed up for a while discussing what had happened. We considered all the possibilities. Maybe we had both just had vivid nightmares due to stress, or maybe one of her roommates had played a prank on us. But deep down, we both knew it didn't feel like just an ordinary night of strange dreams. There was an undeniable tension in the air, like the apartment itself was holding onto some sort of secret. I tried to brush it off, convincing myself that we were both just overreacting. But the events of the night left me feeling uneasy. The idea that someone could have snuck into the apartment without us noticing, and then disappeared without a trace, was deeply unsettling. After all, nothing was stolen, and nothing seemed out of place, except for the open patio door. How could we not have noticed someone coming in? And why did the doors seem to open on their own? We decided to leave the apartment for a while, needing a break from the heavy, oppressive feeling that lingered in the air. But even as we walked outside into the fresh air, we couldn't shake the sense that we were being followed, watched. The normal, everyday sounds of the street felt distant and muffled, as if we were in a world that didn't quite belong to us. Over the next few days, we talked about it a lot. My friend seemed more nervous than usual, constantly checking the locks and closing the windows with extra care. She even started having trouble sleeping. I noticed that she would sometimes freeze, mid-conversation, as though she had heard something strange in the background, something I couldn't hear. It was as though the events of that night had shaken her more than she let on. We tried to move on, convincing ourselves that it was just a coincidence or perhaps an accumulation of stress and exhaustion. But no matter how hard we tried to dismiss it, the memory of that night still haunted us. We often talked about it, wondering if the strange energy we felt upon first arriving at the apartment had been a warning, or if there was something more to it, something we just couldn't explain. Even now, months later, every time I visit her, I can't help but feel a sense of unease when I walk into her apartment. It's as if the walls still hold on to the memories of that night, and no matter how hard we try to forget, it remains with us, lurking in the background. And sometimes, just sometimes, I swear I can feel a faint presence watching, waiting. 2 years ago, something strange happened to my best friend and me, and we still can't figure it out. We've talked about it many times, but haven't found any answers. My best friend and I went to the mountains with 2 other close friends to hike and run. It was winter, and the weather was terrible with a lot of ice and snow. The parking lot at the start of the trail was closed due to some road work, so we had to park a few miles away on a long, empty road. No one else was in the park that day except us. Now, we often go on outdoor trips together, but my best friend and I usually go ahead of the other 2, as we're in better shape and can move faster than them. We usually finish early and wait in the car for the others. That day, we finished much earlier than usual. My friend and I were jogging back to the car when we saw an old cemetery by the road. I suddenly turned off the road, laughing, and pulled my friend with me to check it out and explore for a minute before heading back to the car, which we could see just down the road. After this, we kept jogging to the car. Once we got there, we started waiting for our 2 friends to finish their hike. About 30 minutes passed, but we still didn't see them. Our car was parked facing the opposite direction from where they would come, so we kept turning around to check and make sure we didn't miss them. In that moment, my best friend and I saw 2 people in the distance running toward us. I said, "Oh, there they are." My friend said, "They're moving fast," but as they got closer, we realized it wasn't our 2 female friends. It was a man and a woman, and they were dressed exactly like my best friend and me. The woman had long blonde hair, just like me, and both of them were wearing hats, just like we were. I said, "Wait, that's not them." We got really confused, and then we both went quiet, starting to feel a bit scared. The 2 runners suddenly turned toward the cemetery, with the woman pulling the man and laughing, just like we had done earlier. Then, they suddenly disappeared. My best friend and I looked at each other, and both said, "That was us." We just knew it, and it really freaked us out. We were shaken up. A few moments later, we saw our friends walking toward the car from the same direction. We asked if they had seen anyone hiking or running ahead of them, but they said they hadn't seen anyone. We haven't stopped talking about this and have spent the last couple of years trying to find a logical explanation, but nothing makes sense. A few years ago, my best friend, 2 other close friends, and I decided to go on a hiking trip in the mountains. It was winter, and the weather was awful, snowstorm, ice, and the bitter cold that made the air feel like needles against our skin. We knew it would be a challenging hike, but we were used to the outdoors and were looking forward to the adventure. We had planned to meet early in the morning, but by the time we arrived, the parking lot near the trailhead was already closed due to roadwork. The only option was to park several miles away and walk down an empty, icy road to the entrance. No other cars were there, and there wasn't a soul in sight. The kind of quiet you only get in places where no one else dares to go. The trail was slippery, but we were in high spirits. My best friend and I always stayed ahead of the others, as we could move faster. This day was no different. The snow crunched under our boots as we jogged, pushing ourselves harder than usual to keep warm. Our friends were far behind, but we didn't mind, we were used to waiting. After a while, we finished the trail much earlier than expected, and we made our way back to the car. As we were jogging down the road, something caught my eye, a small, abandoned cemetery off the trail. It looked eerie, surrounded by tall, snow-covered trees. On a whim, I veered off the road and pulled my friend with me, suggesting we explore for a few minutes before heading back to the car. The cemetery was unsettling but oddly fascinating, with old, weathered headstones standing against the gray sky. We spent a few moments there, looking around, before jogging back to the car, our footsteps echoing in the cold silence. Once we reached the car, we waited for our two friends, who were still out on the trail. Time passed, and we began to get worried. It was unusual for them to take this long, especially since we were way ahead of schedule. Our car was parked in such a way that we could see the road, but we still couldn't spot them. We checked the road again, turning around every so often to make sure we didn't miss them. Then, out of nowhere, we saw two figures running toward us. I pointed and said, "There they are." My best friend agreed, but as the figures came closer, something didn't feel right. The woman had long, blonde hair, just like me. The man was wearing a jacket and a hat, identical to what my friend had on. We both froze, watching in disbelief as the two figures ran towards us, matching our exact appearance, down to the hats. I said, "That's not them. This doesn't make sense." My heart began racing as the strange figures closed the distance. My best friend and I exchanged confused glances, both of us beginning to feel an unsettling sense of dread. As they neared, they suddenly veered toward the cemetery, the woman pulling the man by the hand. They were laughing, just like we had been earlier, but then, just like that, they disappeared into thin air. We stood frozen, the strange figures' laughter still echoing in our ears. We both knew, in that moment, that we had just seen something that shouldn't have been possible. "That was us," my best friend whispered, her voice trembling. It wasn't just a feeling, it was like a shared realization. We had seen versions of ourselves, running toward the cemetery. Shaken and scared, we started to question everything. How could this happen? Was it some kind of weird glitch in reality? We were both too freaked out to speak much more. We stayed silent for a long time, just staring at the spot where they had disappeared, wondering if we'd lost our minds. Just then, we saw our two friends finally walking toward the car. They came from the same direction as the figures, and we immediately asked if they had seen anyone running ahead of them. They looked confused and said, "No, we haven't seen anyone at all." That was when it really hit us. Our minds were racing, trying to make sense of what we had seen, but it didn't add up. We'd seen something that didn't belong to this world. There was no rational explanation, just an eerie feeling that we'd crossed some kind of boundary, one that we couldn't return from. We drove away in silence, each of us wondering if it had all been a shared hallucination. We still can't explain what happened that day, but it's something we'll never forget. Every time we talk about it, we come to the same conclusion: sometimes, reality is stranger than we think. We haven't gone back to that cemetery since, and every time we pass that mountain road, there's a part of us that wonders if we'll see those figures again.